Growing up, I honestly considered myself more of a Sega kid than a Nintendo kid. Of course, we had Nintendo first in my household, but when I was able to make a choice on a console I wanted the Sega Genesis. I considered myself so much of a Sega kid that I even bought the Sega CD from my friend John. I spoke about having the Sega CD way back in episode 27 of the podcast, so if you want to hear more about my experiences with that briefly released console, you can go check that out. For the Sega company, the latter part of the 1990s proved to be the end for them as far as making consoles. In 2001, they stopped making them. In the in-between, though, from when I got the Genesis to when they stopped making consoles, there's a brief time that there was something called the Sega Channel. In researching for future podcasts, I found this. I had never heard of it, despite this being right in my wheelhouse for my age of being really into video games. So I thought it would be fun to go way back in the day and share all that I've learned about the Sega Channel. Sega! What was known as the Sega Channel was first available in the United States starting June 1st, 1994, so over 30 years ago. The mid-1990s, that's when PlayStation started coming out, Nintendo 64, and the gaming industry began to boom with technological advancements, innovative ideas. That's where Sega comes in. They introduced a service that could have revolutionized how video games were delivered and played. They were kind of ahead of their time with this service known as the Sega Channel. This was conceived, the Sega Channel, at a time when video game consoles relied heavily on physical cartridges, or with PlayStation, more of the CD-type games. The idea of the Sega Channel was to provide gamers with a new way to access a wide variety of games without the need to purchase each one individually. So what you're looking at is closer to streaming online. The service was developed in collaboration with Time Warner Cable. They aim to leverage the existing cable television infrastructure to deliver games directly to the Sega Genesis console. By subscribing to the Sega Channel, users could download games via their cable connection and play them on their console, giving them access to a rotating library of titles each month. Think about how familiar that sounds these days. Downloading games, instant access, a flat fee to play a whole bunch of different games. This is 30 years ago. The innovation of the Sega Channel was driven by several key motivations. Expand the gaming experience, where Sega aimed to provide a more flexible and expansive gaming experience, so users could try out a variety of games without committing to a purchase. Kids of the 90s, think about how much video games cost. $40, $50, $60. And it was very hard, if damn near impossible, to return a game. They'd make you jump through hoops as far as getting it returned to Toys R Us or Electronics Boutique. Another motivation of the Sega Channel was competing with rental stores. Because back then with Blockbuster Video, Hollywood Video, All-Star Video, name your whatever video, they didn't just have VHS. They had video games. You could rent games, you could rent consoles. But this was aiming to allow people to do that from home, so you wouldn't have to get in the car and drive down the street to Blockbuster.
And this is the best way to get video games.
Now again.
Sega Channel, over 70 hot games a month for your Genesis machine. No lines, no limits, no late fees, just unlimited play on your TV. Sega Channel, less than $15 a month. Call your cable company now. Sega Channel, the only way to get it is to get it.
A third motivation that actually really interests me was the idea of extending the lifespan of the Sega Genesis. It was a way to keep people playing their console, even as newer consoles came out from PlayStation, Nintendo. If you could constantly download new games to your old console, there's really not a need to get a different console. The more that I researched this, the more I kept coming back to the shock that I had never heard of the Sega Channel. I don't think that my mother and stepfather would have let me get it and subscribe to it. But the fact that it slipped through the cracks of my life when I was 17 years old just blows my mind. Sega Channel was so far ahead of its time with digital distribution long before digital storefronts like Steam, PlayStation Network, Xbox Live. 30 years ago, Sega Channel provided a form of digital game distribution. They had the subscription model, which it's now become standard in the digital age with services like Xbox Game Pass, PlayStation Now. The Sega Channel kind of made the blueprint for it, or at least started the groundwork for others to come and make it better. A major selling point that would have been for me if I'd known about it was the content variety. Every month, subscribers could access up to 50 games, including new releases, classics, exclusive titles. That rotating library concept, that would make the subscription worth the price right there. I'm trying to think at my peak as a Sega Genesis or PlayStation player, how many games I owned. It might have been 6 to 8. It sure as hell wasn't 50. So having the access of that many games would be incredible. Another of the innovations of the Sega Channel was the idea of interactive media, as they offered demos, special events, downloadable content. It was a precursor to the multimedia experiences common today. Kids that are growing up now playing video games have no idea that that's not how things were. There's so much trial and error and advancements in all of the years and decades of games to get to where we are now. But being the first, being an innovator, there's challenges with that. In July 1998, the Sega Channel was discontinued. And obviously there were several factors that led to this. 4 years they tried. But first and foremost, it was the technological limitations. Think about how different gaming was back then, 30 years ago. Trying to do downloadable content, doing things like relying heavily on the cable infrastructure, which varied in quality and availability. Download speeds being so slow that it would lead to long wait times and service interruptions of the game. You imagine playing some game and getting so far in it and then it just pauses because there's no connection. You'd smash your Genesis. Another issue was the cost of the subscription, which was about $15 a month. Plus you needed a specific adapter, which that cost money. Like I said, I didn't know about this back then, and I don't think my mother and stepfather would have gotten this for me. $15 a month, plus a special adapter. They didn't have scholarships for gaming or esports or anything, so it wasn't like I could write it off as I'm learning for college. Plus, there was more market competition. By the late 90s, the gaming landscape kept evolving. Sony PlayStation, Sega Saturn, they were offering enhanced graphics and gameplay, which is ironic because Sega Channel wanted to keep people using their Genesis. Then they released the Saturn, and that diverted attention away from the Genesis and the Sega Channel. There was also actually a limited game library. The rotating selections was innovative, but it was also restrictive. If gamers wanted permanent access to specific games, they couldn't do that. They would still have to go buy the actual cartridge. So it would come down to how much money do you really want to spend on your video gaming habits? But the biggest issue with the Sega Channel, and I've mentioned it several times now, it was marketing challenges. I'd never heard of this until I was researching things for the future podcast episodes.
Got a Sega Genesis? Cool. Want to rule your friends for the rest of their pathetic little lives? Then call now to get hooked into Sega Channel, the coolest way to get your games. You'll get wicked new stuff that's only on Sega Channel. Up to 50 ripping games a month for less than 50 cents a day.
So trying to get the word out there to effectively communicate the value, the functionality of the Sega Channel to a broad audience was challenging. This left many potential customers either unaware of the service, like me, or aware of it but unsure of what exactly the benefits were, because it was new. At its peak in early to mid-1995, Sega Channel had 250,000 subscribers. And based on the time, 1995, and just the idea of this Sega Channel, I don't know if that's a good or a bad number, but numbers started going down after that. And then the rise of the internet, 96, 97, 98, it drove people away from things like the Sega Channel. Because then you could play games online a little, really slowly. So it was kind of a victim of timing too, where you had this 2-year window before the internet really became a household thing. And it's like if you didn't hook the people by then, you were screwed because everyone went on the internet instead. That being said, even though the Sega Channel was discontinued after just 4 years, its influence on the gaming industry is undeniable. It was a pioneer in digital distribution, subscription-based gaming, concepts that are common now. The Sega Channel demonstrated that potential, and it was a bold experiment highlighting Sega's willingness to innovate and push the boundaries. But like I said a few times, it seemed to be the signaling of the beginning of the end as far as them as creating consoles. Less than 3 years after the Sega Channel went under, they stopped making consoles. But they still do make games, so Sega's not gone, they're just not around in the console market. But yeah, that's the wild story of the Sega Channel. Do you remember it? Were you a subscriber to it? My biggest takeaway is that there was a Sega Channel and I didn't know about it.